Hey guys, Anthony here with another episode of the DM's Journal for Out of the Abyss D&D 5th Edition Adventure Campaign book. Hopefully you've been following along with our story so far, because I'm sure not going to do a recap since the very beginning. I don't even know what episode this is, maybe 8 or 9. I can't recall. We're not quite halfway through the book, but I'd say we're pretty deep into it now for sure. I've been enjoying it. My players, I think, have really been enjoying it as well. Sorry that this video is coming a little bit late. We had our usual Sunday night play session, and the day that I'm recording this is like Thursday. But it's been crazy busy for me, so this was the soonest I could get to it. I have had a couple videos in the wings that I've uploaded in the meantime, not necessarily for D&D, but there is a second episode of At the Players Pub that's coming at you soon, so you can look forward to that as well if you enjoyed the last conversation that I got to have with a few of my players. Got to kind of put some names to some faces and some faces to some characters and that kind of thing, so that was good. So because it's Thursday, the session's not quite as fresh in my mind, so I guess today will really be a big test of my memory, which I've been told is not good, so let's see what we can do. If I do recall, though, last time we left off, I believe they had just finished fighting a flesh golem that they had found Pepito in the Whorlstone tunnels underneath Gracklestug as they were hunting for the Darrow known as Drokki, who seems to be implemented in a few different kind of plot lines that the characters have been handed by various NPCs that they've met in the city of Gracklestug in the Underdark. So they fought Pepito, they defeated him, which felt good for probably specifically Sir Robert Bastian, our paladin, because he just hated him for killing Prince Darendel earlier in the campaign. So there was a little bit of closure there. It was a tough fight, but they made it through. No casualties, nothing like that. Which it was interesting, though. It sparked a bit of a discussion between me and my players about, how the combats were working, how challenging they were finding it. And I kind of got two different messages, or I don't know if they were different messages or just merely communicated to me so that they appeared like two different messages. But it seemed like some people were saying that it was too difficult. I'm not as on board with that. To me, Out of the Abyss, and I think for most players, and there is the Facebook group for the dungeon masters who run this campaign, and I kind of took it to them as well to get their opinion, and they were pretty much on my side, just in terms of that it is a grueling campaign. It is meant to be difficult. It is meant to make the players feel a sense of hopelessness, especially at this stage in the story. To me, hearing some of the complaints of it's very difficult says that we're on track for now. So and not to mention, it's like, hey, it's easy to focus on some of the negatives, aka, well, I seem to be getting downed a lot, or it's the enemies are very difficult to defeat, that kind of thing. Yes, it can be easy to get caught up in that, but I drew to their attention, well, no one's died yet, and that's pretty impressive. And you guys, as much as you're struggling, have overcome every challenge that's been thrown at you in a meaningful way. So there was that. The second message, though, which I think, interestingly enough, I understand better now after this additional play session that happened on Sunday. The additional issue was, well, the fights are not very dynamic. It just seems to be always the case of, well, here's this big baddie or these big baddies, and they're just really tough, and there's nothing we can do but trade blows with them, and hopefully we survive to tell the tale. And that one I can understand a little bit more. But again, being a first-time DM and running this campaign, which is not recommended for first-time DMs, though some of the feedback I'm getting, I'm doing an okay job, so I'm happy about that. I said, yeah, that, I can understand that. I want the fights to be interesting. I want them to feel dynamic. So I was again at a crossroads where I was thinking to myself, okay, well, is this an issue of the way that I'm running it? Or is this circumstance? Or is this the campaign? And like I was saying, I really kind of discovered that more after our newest play session, because I didn't change anything. I didn't really do anything different. I just continued on with the story, mostly as written. And what I was finding is that the feedback I got from the players after this most recent session was, oh wow, see, like that was awesome. There was environmental hazards, there was this, that, and the other thing that made the fights feel a little bit more fun and all that kind of stuff. And that for me confirmed the idea that, you know what, it was probably more or less just circumstance and context. They are right that the previous fights, like against the skeletal minotaurs, like against the flesh golem, like against there's another one that I'm blanking on right now, but those were definitely challenges that were, maybe the stone giant, I can't remember. Those were challenges that were very much in the realm more that was, okay, well, here's this big thing and you just have to fight it and hope to live. And I think the reason they were feeling some of those feelings were because those kept stacking up. It kept being an issue of, hey, you just happen to be encountering things in a situation that are operating this way. That's not it's not a preference of me. I'm not choosing that. But if there's any kind of learning or growth that I'm taking away from this, it's that when determining random encounters, to add a little bit more to those. There's ones that the book has very much pre-constructed that kind of they operate that way for a reason, and I don't think there's ever really been too much of a complaint about those, at least not that I know of. But yes, going forward for random encounters, I'll be making sure to either throw in an environmental element or tweaking what the encounter wound up being, or adding in, or even entirely replacing maybe a combat encounter with environmental encounter. So that's one of the ways that I guess I'm kind of taking that input and as a DM saying, okay, well, what can I do about this? But also learning a little bit that sometimes the players and the DM are going to clash, not in a negative way where we're at each other's throats or anything, but more in terms of like the players need to trust the DM. If they're feeling hopeless, that's perhaps a story element, not one where they have to say, well, it's always going to be like this and this is the way you're running it and we don't like the way you're running it and it's boring or it's too hard or whatever. I think sometimes it's a matter of, the book has it this way for a reason. And if this was a homebrew campaign, perhaps this wouldn't be encountered at all. But I'm running a pre-written story, and that story has certain elements to it and certain emotional tones to it, and that's part of it. So I think that ultimately at the end of all of it, I learned a little bit as a DM, they've learned a little bit as characters, and we're going to see how that learning process continues as we continue to forge through this adventure in the Underdark. So that's just a little piece I wanted to bring up as a result of our 2 play sessions ago. So getting back to where we were then for this week that we did, I had a full party. We had I don't know how long I've been doing this that I can't just rattle them all off, but we had our bard Ken LaFlaunt, we had our barbarian Bard, we had our paladin Sir Robert, we had our warlock Colby Jack, and we had our monk Uta, and that is of course not mentioning their race because I'm getting bored of doing that, and they're mostly half elves with some crazier stuff thrown in there, like the turtle person, or turtle person I should say, named a turtle. So that we had a full party, and we kind of picked up where we left off, and it was an idea of, well, what do you guys want to do now? And they had some options available to them in terms of how they wanted to go about the tunnels thing, but ultimately at this point, after encountering the golem, they're like, well, maybe we really should stick to just trying to track down this Drokki character and find out what we can. So our barbarian, who had been the tracker so far, her character is proficient in survival. Continued her checks, and I don't think she failed a single check all night, because it is a very real possibility that they get lost in the Whorlstone tunnels to some extent. And that's not a game mechanic. It's literally just, look, you're going through these tunnels, and as long as you're making those survival checks, I will tell them, yeah, he went this way. But there's a lot of crossroads and forks in the road, and should there come a point at one of those forks in the road where they say the check has failed, then I'm going to say, well, you don't know. You're just going to have to pick one and go down it. And that could wind up wrapping them back around to a space they've already been in. And if they fail to pick up the tracks a few more times, they could just wind up wandering aimlessly. And there's some rooms that are further, or rather what I should say is closer to the entrance, that they skipped or avoided, that they might wind up accidentally stumbling backwards into because they get lost. So I'm really interested to see if any of that happens. But so far, I don't think the barbarian has rolled lower than a 14, and to me, that's sufficient enough to say, yeah, you can find this little Darrow's footprints in the dirt kind of thing. So that's been fine. They've been doing that, and essentially the crux of our last play session was that they were following along. They got to a spot where they found this mesa, like this room, didn't have any hostiles in it, but it was this raised platform that they climbed up. And one of the things that they found is that they were hearing all this noise. It sounded like a cacophony of noise and conversations and sounds. And what they found is that if they went up to the top, they recognized that they were hearing all of the noises of Gracklestug, the city of Gracklestug, and it was being augmented because all of the Whorlstone tunnels is just suffused with Fizrez, I think, if I'm pronouncing that right. And Fizrez has been present in our campaign a few other times, but it hasn't really come into play yet. I'm thinking it will eventually in the Whorlstone tunnels because we have a few casters. But if I've never talked about it before, Fizrez is basically like one of the last elements of the ancient elven kingdoms that existed, and it's this like hyper magically suffused substance that kind of exists in various areas around the Underdark, and it's really started reacting violently or strongly to the presence of, you know, the fact that demons have entered the Underdark. So it's a little bit more volatile than it usually is, and it has some in-game effects that I don't want to quite talk about yet because none of them have manifested for my players, and I want to keep that a little bit of a surprise. But it's only a matter of time in the tunnels. So what the deal is that the Fizrez is kind of magically augmenting the sounds of the city above in this particular place, and the book basically says if any of the characters want to try and focus, if they succeed, there's a good chance that they can basically understand, they can hone in on one thing. And it's a really neat mechanic because it essentially says they can ask one question that has anything to do with, you know, Gracklestug or the tunnels or whatever, and within reason it can be answered. And if they fail, there could be some detriments to that. So I had two players try to do this organically. I didn't prompt or anything. I think that the Warlock, I think it was I can't remember who went up anyways, and one of them basically said, well, I just want to listen in to see if I can hear anything. I said, great, take your check. Passed with flying colors. I said, okay, well, what are you trying to listen, or what are you trying to figure out? And they said, well, I want to know if I can hear Drokki. And I was like, yes, you can. And that helped them point them more in the direction, again, of where Drokki was or whereabouts and what direction he was going. So that worked. And I think the Paladin did the same thing, and he passed, but not... Basically, he passed enough to avoid anything negative happening, but not enough to gain any gleam of wisdom out of what they were hearing. So they did this, and one of the things that they found out during this play session as well was that there's these two unique mushrooms that were growing in the tunnels. One was called Bigwig, and one was called Pygmywort. And Pygmywort was one where if you take it, and this is all very Alice in Wonderland, you will shrink down to like basically being tiny. And then if you eat the bigwig, you revert back to your regular size. So this was helping them navigate the tunnels, and they found it through following Drokki's footprints, basically, and through some of the help of Sereth, their dark elf NPC companion, who is somewhat familiar with the growths in the Underdark, and so they figured this out, and it's helping them get through little cracks that they would otherwise be too big to get through, which has allowed them to avoid a few rooms here and there, which is that's good. So they've got these, and that from the Mesa they use those mushrooms to get through another crack in the wall, and eventually it led them to a point where they found this big heavy-set door in the wall, and they said, okay, well, what's this all about? So they're doing some investigation about that, and eventually like, well, whatever, we're gonna break the door down. So they break down the door, and what they find inside is what essentially looks like a grow-op. It's the Grey Ghost laboratory, and it consists of two main areas. One is like a pit in the ground that's growing like all kinds of different mushrooms with like a fertilizer system of pipes over it, like that's where they're cultivating whatever they're cultivating. And then the other area is like an actual lab. And they enter the room, and right away they get ambushed because the Duergar Grey Ghosts who are inside hear them break down the door. And as the characters know, as maybe you know from watching, the Duergar can turn invisible at will. And they also have the innate ability to cast, like, enlarge or shrink, or whatever the opposite of that is called. And so two of them had cast enlarge on themselves and were invisible. And so as the characters entered the room, they were ambushed by these two giant Duergar warriors, basically. And the third one ran over to the fertilizer system and kind of spun the fertilizer pipe at them and just opened it up so that it was spraying, fertilizer at them, which has the same effect, more or less, as the spell Stinking Cloud. And that actually worked out more potently than I thought it would. It doesn't do damage, but it immobilized many of the really potent close combat characters. So it made the fight a little bit more interesting and dynamic. And then on the second round of combat, out from the lab area runs another Duergar, but he's an alchemist. He's covered in vials and flasks, and he starts whipping like acid flasks and alchemist fire while they're fighting these other two giant dwarves. And the other guy who had opened up the valve was throwing javelins. So it was an interesting fight. I think that they really enjoyed that fight. That was some of the feedback I got. It had environmental hazards. The challenge wasn't overwhelming, and they were able to get. This is the key: is that after they defeated these Duergar by basically looting the bodies and by exploring the lab, they got a bunch of cool stuff that now they feel that they have a little bit more tools at their disposal, because specifically in ransacking the lab, one of the things they find is, healing potions and psychic resistance potions and, additional flasks of acid and alchemist fire. And, so they have a little bit more on their bat belt, so to speak. So I think they're feeling a little bit more confident in moving forward to tackle some of that stuff. So yeah, that was good. And then afterward they did some exploring within that room, and the fight took a chunk of time for sure. And ultimately where we wound up ending off the session was where they decided to do a little bit of a rest. I think a short rest, I believe, and. Or no, not yeah, it was a short rest because they took an hour. They found some recipes, some alchemical recipes written in Dwarvish. They were trying to decipher, and it says it takes about an hour to do that. And I said, well, it might take about an hour. They said, yeah, we're cool with that. We'll kind of do like a short rest, and we'll read over this stuff. And while they were doing that, Colby, who jumped down into the mushroom pit to kind of examine, and he got a bunch of cool, mushrooms that are doing that are useful for different things. He found like another one of those little cracks in the wall near the back, and he said, okay, well, I'm going to take one of those pygmy warts and go in here with my familiar, the little imp Poncho, and I want to check out what's in there. I said, okay. So they go in, and there's this little, like a miniature network of caves, and he stays at the entrance and sends Poncho, who is invisible, ahead to scout. And he says, okay, I want Poncho to go and take his first left. So he does that. And I say, and as he does that, what he sees is that, two giant spiders drop down behind him, and in front of him is this really gross, demonic-looking, humanoid-esque giant spider, and they immediately attack and destroy Poncho. And then that's where we left it. And so there's this kind of interesting issue now where most of the party is back in the lab, resting and looking at what they can find and decipher this, that, and the other thing. And Colby's by himself, not trapped. He very much has the ability to just turn around and leave. But now there is the issue of initiative that needs to be rolled. And if those creatures roll a higher initiative than Colby, it may very well be that they get to him before he has a moment to turn around and leave. So it's not likely to happen, but if it does happen, then I think that it'll mean is that there's another combat that's going to go down. So we'll see what happens with that. It's a cool little side piece if they do wind up doing that. If not, it's like it has no real bearing anyways. Of course, it means more XP for the group. But yeah, it was a pretty interesting session, and I think that everyone had a good time doing it. So that was pretty much part 2 of exploring the Whorlstone tunnels. I think that from what I've read and from how I've prepped, that the party probably has 2 more sessions left of being in the Whorlstone tunnels. Maybe 1 if they really power through, depending on some of the choices they make and how the combats go. I think it's possible to do it in 1, but it's more likely just because, people chat around the table, and sometimes we start late, and sometimes people have things to do. So I think it's likely that we're going to be there for another 2 sessions. But there's some really cool fights that are ahead. There's some really cool pieces of information that they'll get. And then, of course, all of it has bearings on how they choose to handle getting out of Gracklstugh and continuing to try and find a way out of the Underdark. So that's where we left off. And that's where I'm going to leave you guys for today. So I hope you enjoyed the little debrief. And sorry, the chair is moving. My dog is hanging around here. I hope you enjoyed the little catch up on where my party and I are at in Out of the Abyss D&D campaign. And we'll catch you next week with another update. Okay, bye now.